In this video, I'm going to show how you can use the Python 3 requests module in order to get HTML web content from a website. So let's discuss the requests module. The requests module is a Python module that contains functions to help retrieve data from web pages. The basic usage is as follows. First, we will import the requests module. Then we are going to use the get method from the request module and pass in a string, the string web address that we wish to retrieve. This method is going to return a requests object, and we'll save it into a variable here. I named the variable page. And then from that requests object, we are going to be able to access several properties of the object to retrieve things such as whether the request was successful, what's the content of the request, what's the type of the requests, etc. So let's look a little deeper into this module. So here I have an example of defining some URL. This is just a string value that contains a web address. So here's my fake web address that I have created. And I will pass that string address into the get method of the requests module, and this will return a request object. If I were to access the text property of this object, I would get the HTML content as a string type. And I say HTML, but we can retrieve things such as images and other content, not just text. The status code property returns an integer value that describes the state of our request. Did it succeed? Did it fail? Is it forbidden? Etc. And we'll look at some status codes on the next slide. The encoding will give us information on how the file is encoded. The content will return the contents of this request as a binary type. So for example, if I were to request an image file, I could get the binary content of that image file. And then the headers property gives us some additional information that is provided by the server when we make our request. And so there's some information inside the headers that we could use when we are trying to process files. So there are more properties available, but here's a kind of a starter group of properties. We talked about the page.status code. Here are some examples of common status codes you might encounter. 200 is the one you're looking for. 200 means the page was retrieved successfully. Other common ones are 404. So if you try to request a page that doesn't exist, the website can return a 404 status code. 500 sometimes occurs if there's some type of server error. And there are many more codes, but this just gives us a start. And then there are some additional input parameters we can pass into the get method when we are trying to retrieve a web page. So here the first input parameter is the web address, the string URL. Then I'm going to attach a dictionary called a header. And in this header I can provide more information about myself. For example, I can define my user agent name. In the previous video we showed that there are some famous user agents such as Googlebot, and Googlebot defines Googlebot helps the server that we're talking to understand who's making the request. So we can give our user agent, we can name ourselves when we are trying to build a web scraper. And then we can also supply a timeout value in seconds. So sometimes you will try to make a connection to a web page and it will just hang and hang and hang. And to avoid your program just becoming stuck, you can set a timeout. And it's good practice to set a timeout for your GET request. And so in this example, I named my user agent MyBot version 1.0. I set a timeout of 3 seconds. We have some website. And then I'm going to pass these values into my GET method and try to get this page. And this value will either return a request object and the page was a success or some form of success, or maybe it times out and I will print that it was a timeout issue. Now the timeout returns an exception which will crash your program usually. So this is why I have this request inside a try block, and then I'm handling that a possible exception with the except block. Let's do a couple quick live examples here. So here I have a Jupyter Notebook page ready to go, and I'm going to first start by importing the requests module. Okay, after I import the request module, I will have access to that get method. Now let's define a URL. Well, in our previous example, we looked at the nasa.gov site, and so I'm going to use this as my starting URL. And I'm going to say URL is equal to, and I'm going to post in or create this URL as a string value. Next, I'm going to create a page variable to hold my response object, and I'm going to call requests.get and pass in the URL. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to print the status code property value that is returned from this page. And we see we get a 200, which is an OK status code, a correct status code. So so what this get request method did is it traveled to this page and it retrieved, it made a successful connection, retrieved the HTML of that page, and the status code is telling me success. Now, just to show you that not all pages return a success, let me try to navigate to www.nasa.gov, and let's go to aliens.html. This is most likely not a real page on the NASA website. And when I run this, notice that the status code I get back is 404. 404 meant page not found. So when we make a connection to a website, we can check the status code to see did we make a valid connection? Was the connection okay? Or are we getting returned a request object that is indicating that the page does not exist, or some other error message? So let's look at some of the other properties of this page request object. I'm going to say page.encoding, and we'll run this, and we see that this is encoding as an ISO 8859. Sometimes when you're dealing with pages, the encoding may come into play. Beautiful Soup, the module we will be using to pass this page information into, it can usually auto-detect encoding, but it's good to kind of understand where we can retrieve that information. So there's the encoding property. Let's look at the page.text property. And here I get to see my HTML code. So in the text property of my request object, I see my doc type HTML, and I start seeing all my HTML tags. And if you remember the video from the previous video, we were looking for embedded article titles that had a title value, and here I can see those NASA article titles embedded in the data of this HTML. Okay. All right, so that's the text property. If I look at the page.content property, the content property is returning what looks like the same data, but I see this have a little b in front of this data string. This is telling me this is a binary dump of the data that is returned. Okay, and that we'll see how we might use that in just a moment. And then let's look at some other things. Let's look at the page.headers information. The headers this is a dictionary of values that is included along with the page that is returned that contains extra information coming from the server. So we can see the server this came from is an Amazon S3. We can see some other information. I don't know what half of this means. But one interesting piece is this content type. So because this is a dictionary, I can use a key value lookup. So I can say, I want to look up the header's content type value. So I'm typing in the key, and I want to get returned. I want the value part returned here. And it says this file is a text/HTML file. Okay, that makes sense. But not all the files that we travel or try to request will necessarily be text files. So for example, here is I have a NASA web page that has that compiles a bunch of images of the sun and shows sunspot information, and it does a daily capture of the sun. And so if I click on this link, it takes me to a list of all of the images a directory that contains all the available images for the sun. And then I can scroll down and select one of these images. And here I have an image of the sun with some sunspots labeled. But if I look at the URL, this is I'm looking at an image file that's hosted on the website. So let's grab this address and see what happens if I navigate to it. So I'm going to replace my URL with the web address to this image file, and then I'm going to try to make this request, and it works. I get a status 200 OK. So now if I look at this page.headers from this file, we see that the content type of this file that we retrieved is an image, a JPEG image. So we can look at the content type value from our requests and determine, do I need to process this as an image, a text file, etc. I want to show you the page.content of this file. So here, because I've retrieved not a web page but an image file, here I'm seeing the binary representation of this image file. This is the binary data of the image. And so if I wanted to do processing of this image, I might pass this page.content value into some image processing library, and maybe I can manipulate the image. All right, one last thing I will show us is the timeout. So if I add a timeout here, which we should get into the habit of doing, if I say timeout equals 0.01 seconds and I try to run this, notice that we timed out before we were able to get to the page here. It threw a connection timeout error. And so that's probably a bit aggressive, but what I could do is I could build a little try-catch around this, and I could try to make a connection to the page, and if it fails, I can have an accept and print a little message, a timeout, and then when I run it, I can either make a connection to the page or timeout. And if I set this to a little more reasonable time, like 3 seconds, and then run it, we see we were able to successfully connect before the timeout, print the status code, etc. All right. Now, leading on to the next set of videos, I'm going to show how we can take after we make a page request to some URL and retrieve the request object, I can take this page.content value and pass it on to the Beautiful Soup module, and then we can start getting into that HTML page data and start searching and looking for the values we want to extract.